Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Way Forward Leader Lunch Break. Well, if you've been watching the Olympics, monitoring the Soviet troop buildup by the Ukraine, or perhaps following the plight of immigrants and refugees, your attentions have certainly begun shifting to the world stage, less so on our national dilemma with the pandemic. The world stage is a theater where Dr. Elliot Posner, chair of the political science department at Case Western Reserve University, has spent his life. From his days as a Peace Corps volunteer in Botswana, to his studies as a Fulbright scholar in Paris and Brussels, to his current role teaching courses on international relations, international political economy, and other courses focused on the international sphere, he has immersed himself in international affairs and monetary policy. If you were to look at his CV, there are 8, count them 8, single-space pages of his writings where he explores international interdependence and regulatory power, financial transformation in the European Union, and European stock markets. He is the author of Voluntary Disruptions, International Soft Law, Finance, and Power. And several fun facts: he's been cited by almost 1,300 scholars for his writings. And in that valuable website, Rate My Professor, 100% of the respondents say they would take a course from him again. His previous presentations include an appearance at the Happy Dog, where he discussed the challenges of the European Union. We're thrilled to have him with us today. Welcome, Dr. Posner.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Miriam. Thanks, Rachel, for setting this up. And thanks so much to all of you for coming and for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to sharing my views on Europe and some of my views on Europe. This is short. I'm looking forward to hearing what you're thinking as well. Just so you know, to repeat a little bit, so you know what you're getting, I am a professor of international relations and a political economist. My interests are largely surrounding the European Union, both the politics inside the European Union and the European Union as a global actor. Among the courses I teach at Case are the politics of the European Union. I've written about how the EU has tried to copy the US venture capital ecosystem. I've written about how the EU and the US deal with their differences in their regulation and the relationship between the EU and international standards. So this background explains why when I think about Europe, I tend to think about Europe through the EU lens, European Union lens. And so my first 2 points, I want to make 3 points today in my short remarks. And the first 2 are about the EU. And because of that, I thought I would just give you a 1, 2, 3 on the EU really fast. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Okay. This is what I'm planning to do. And so very briefly, and I'm just going to shrink all your faces for a second so I can see my screen too. There we go. So the EU is a 70-year-old project. It is the most extraordinary example of international cooperation in the world. It started out with 6 members after World War II. It now has 27. They lost a big one last year, you know, in Brexit with the UK. In addition to adding members over time, the cooperation has deepened and expanded into all kinds of new areas. Why am I not? There we go. Now, there's a lot of confusion for outsiders who don't think about the EU that much because it can seem at times that the EU looks like a state, and it has a lot of the state-like institutions. It has a legislature, a Supreme Court, that sort of thing. But be sure it's not a state. It's missing big pieces to what would count as a sovereign country, a sovereign state. And of course, I'm a professor of international politics. So when I say state, I'm talking about a country, sovereign country, not a state like California or Ohio. just some of the big features, projects of the EU. We've been reading a lot about the NATO expansion because of the crisis with Russia and Ukraine, but the EU also expanded its membership eastward at the end of the Cold War. So the Baltic countries belong, Poland, Hungary. Perhaps the best known accomplishment of the EU is the single market. Many of you know about the euro, or all of you know about the euro. 19 of the 27 members gave up their currency. They have the euro. The EU is a global actor in all kinds of ways. They have combined policies in immigration, environment, data privacy, etc. And they even have joint battalions and send peacekeeping forces across the world. The EU as a unit faces all kinds of challenges. The Russian resurgence, of course, the pandemic, democratic backsliding. Poland and Hungary are the front page stories here. Brexit, of course, and a big one is US uncertainty, the uncertainty about whether the US is going to live up to its security commitments. All right, now let me just move on, move to my, oh, I forgot one, no, I think that's pretty good. For my primer, I want to move into my first point, which I called it gaps, but here I mean gaps in expectations about what the EU can do. And so, so my first point, it's about the EU's response to the pandemic. For some, quite a few Europe watchers, the pandemic fits into a pattern of EU decline. The UK's departure, the migration crisis of 2015, the Eurozone crisis, and now a botched response to COVID-19. So in this picture, the EU looks like a relic of the 20th century, no longer useful, helpful, up to the tasks of the 21st century. However, I think there's another side of the story, and it doesn't get as much play. As a scholar, I can point to some pretty incredible recent examples of deeper cooperation and unified positions in the face of really serious challenges. In the aftermath of the Euro crisis, we saw the emergence of this thing called banking union, where the member governments gave to the European Central Bank the authority to supervise banks and to oversee bailouts. That was a huge step. We saw in the middle of the COVID crisis that the countries committed to issuing mutualized debt, which means Germany is on the hook for if Italy or Spain doesn't pay its debt. That's quite an amazing step and wasn't expected. Nobody would have thought that was possible a few years back. And I should point out that during the negotiations with the UK over Brexit, the 27 remaining countries remained incredibly united, surprised a lot of analysts. I would say, okay, more important than my scholarly observations there is that every corporate executive of a global company, and I'm sure there's some who are members of your distinguished group, they know that you can't ignore or escape Brussels in issues concerning international trade, corporate mergers, data transfers, financial regulation, the chemicals that go into products. All of these things, people who are involved in this know that Brussels is a global player. So my point isn't to deny that the EU faces big challenges and that it's botched a lot of them. It's that analysts tend to treat the EU as if it's a state. And when in fact it isn't. That's not its mission. It doesn't have the authorities or the capacities for this. So the handling of the COVID crisis is a good example of why keeping this in mind can be important. Last spring, my students and I were struck by how Brussels looked flat-footed in what turned out to be a dog-eat-dog competition over vaccines. No one in Europe, not the president of the European Commission, the president of the European Council, or any of the heads of government seemed to be able to do or have the mindset of what President Trump and Boris Johnson were able to do. they used, these leaders were able to, leaders of states were able to use the leverage with vaccine producers to guarantee that their citizens were at the front of the line for vaccines. In comparison, the EU looked like a sucker in a game that it wasn't even playing. But my point is that by the end of the summer, when you saw other more successful rollouts of EU level policies, you can, I think, understanding where the capabilities are, what the EU is in a position to do, it helps us better assess what the role of the EU is in the 21st century. And I think the conclusion is it's not necessarily, it is not that the EU is in decline, but rather it has its place as we go forward. All right, moving to my second point. Ambiguities. So here, I think we might be able to draw a lesson or two from the European experience to help us think about what might be happening in the Russia and Ukraine crisis. I guess the starting point is that in the realm of international politics, one of the sad truths is that not all problems have solutions, and certainly not clean solutions. This is one of the reasons we get so many political fudges, outcomes that are ambiguous and don't seem to provide a long-term solution or even a real solution to the problems at hand. In the European Union, ambiguous solutions are a way of life. Academics sometimes call them incomplete bargains, and they are deeply woven into the European Union architecture. This is because, or partly because, with so many members, so many sovereign countries as members, agreements inevitably get messy. So for a long time, the idea was to get things started with an incomplete solution at time one, knowing that at time two, it can be fixed. Well, recently, these kinds of solutions have come under attack. Critics see them as half-baked compromises that make Europe vulnerable in crises. And of course, they have a point. The two exemplar cases are the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis and banking crisis of 2010 and the migration crisis of 2015. In both instances, calamity struck before the incomplete solutions could be completed. So my thinking here is that it's also worth remembering that there are some examples in which imperfect solutions have served a useful purpose. And I think perhaps one of the best ones is the Irish Protocol, which enabled the UK and the EU to avoid a hard and brutal exit that nobody wanted. Now, the protocol truly defies gravity. I don't want to get into the details, but it allowed both sides to avoid what they didn't want and to say that they won the day. Now, turning to the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, it seems to me, I hope I'm right here, that we're headed towards this territory of ambiguous solutions. And I think this could be a good outcome given the alternatives. So we often hear that time is on Putin's side, as he is in a position to play the long game. But I guess my last thing to say on this note, on this issue, is that I also think that the Europeans know how to play the long game, as I just said. They have lots of tools in their cooperation toolbox, and they know a thing or two about how to leverage their giant market to get what they want. How am I doing for time, Rachel?
You're good. We have a few more minutes.
Okay, so let me move to my very last point, and it'll be shorter. And it's really that I support the deepening transatlantic economic relationship. Now, there was a time not very long ago when most policymakers in the United States and Europe believed that the best way to harness the benefits of international trade was to keep the rules governing trade as separate as possible from other issues like labor, human rights, the environment, and security. Now, these were the founding ideas behind the World Trade Organization that came into being in 1994 and also to the approach that led to very close economic interdependence between China and the United States and China and Europe. This approach, in my view, is looking increasingly like it was a Hail Mary. To think that trading with China would liberalize its political system and dampen geopolitical rivalry do seem quite naive from the vantage point of 2022. The new memo is that trade cannot be separated from these other domains, especially security. Now, this, I think, is very relevant to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Germany desperately wants to cordon off the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from the potential security implications that it could have. Now, you'll remember that the pipeline is supposed to increase the flow of Russian gas into Germany. To me, the impossibility of separating the two, economics and security here, is one of the key lessons of the crisis. And so from this viewpoint, the realities of trade and interdependence lead me, and I think others, to conclude that Europe and the US need to deepen the transatlantic economic relationship. A lot of my research has highlighted transatlantic regulatory clashes, so I'm not a newcomer to these issues, and I do believe that many of the conflicts do reflect real differences in values. I think data transfers is a very good example. It's in the news these days. Yet, the most important thing here is that we do have a good track record of working through these differences, that the EU and the US are closer to each other than either of them are to autocratic countries like China and Russia. And most importantly, that we are not, the US and the EU are not geopolitical rivals. So I'm a big fan of the new EUUS Trade and Technology Council, which was launched last September in Pittsburgh. And I also believe, based on my research on financial regulation, that arrangements between the EU and the US of the kind that were proposed last October for aluminum and steel can raise the regulatory and environmental bar for the entire global economy. So I'm going to stop there, open it up for questions, and anything else you have on your minds.
Elliot, thank you so much. And we have had some questions come in, and probably not a surprise, many of them around the current happenings in Russia. So I think it probably would be helpful to maybe just talk a little bit more about, really, where is this coming from? Why now? What's the angle here for Russia kind of pushing its might against the Ukraine?
Well, of course, I write about political economy and the EU, and this is security, but that doesn't mean I don't have anything to say about it, right? So let me just say that this is not a new story, that I mentioned before, that Russia is playing a long game, and it's been incremental and gradual. We've been talking about a Russian resurgence for many years now, even before Russia gobbled up Crimea in 2014. So it's not new. And I think most international relations experts do think that this is, you can trace it back to what happened at the end of the Cold War. And from the Russian perspective, that the United States and its allies took advantage of an imploding economic system in the Soviet Union. Now, so just remember what happened. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't just NATO that expanded and took on members that were part of the Russian sphere of influence and part of the Soviet Union. it was the European Union. So it was sort of the Russia handled the NATO handled the security stuff, and the EU was more in the domain of economics, creating an institutionalized economic community for these countries. And from the Russian point of view, at least some Russians, that, it wasn't just that they took advantage, but also that they didn't keep their word in some, there's this huge dispute, and scholars are busy arguing over what exactly was said about Ukraine and NATO expansion.
Do you feel that the Russian crisis could ultimately turn into a new turning point for the EU-US relations, where they've become strained under previous administration, and really start to maybe get repaired as maybe increasing European trust in the US?
Well, I do think that we're already, even before this crisis, we saw improvement in the relationship after the Trump administration. I did mention that last October, it was the same week as COP26, though not part of COP26. The meeting, the international meeting following up the Paris climate change agreement. So during that week, the US and the EU announced a real breakthrough with aluminum and steel. And it was really interesting for people like me who pay attention to how countries cooperate. The proposal was, they call it like a club model of cooperation, where here a small group of like-minded countries with big markets and enforcement capacities, meaning that they can keep out foreign firms that don't comply with their rules. So this is the club, and so the idea is that you can get the California effect. If you're familiar with that, the idea that countries that have stringent regulation in a global economy can create incentives for other countries to follow suit. So this is really attractive in the area for if the mission is decarbonization, and it's hard to get everybody on the same page. You can do it in different ways. And one way is for the EU and the US to come together and say, okay, we're going to have these stringent regulations. And if you want to participate in our markets, firms, then you're going to have to comply. And so the idea is that the firms will go back to their countries and say, we need to be compliant with the US and the EU. And so you ratchet up. Instead of a race to the bottom in regulation, you get a race to the top. And so this is the club model. And so this was proposed for steel and aluminum in October. So to me, that was already a turning point in the transatlantic relationship. It showed good faith on both sides and in a really smart area. But yes, I do think that this crisis could trigger a real shift. Because as I said, when you're looking around the globe, I think it's become obvious to everyone that it's much more difficult to have sustained economic relations with autocratic countries that don't share our values. Now, we've known this for a long time, and there just was a set of ideas coming out of the Cold War. Some people call it the neoliberal moment. But this idea that came out of some econ departments in the United States that trade is so important and so good in so many ways and helps everyone, that we need to push off environmental concerns and push off labor concerns and human rights concerns. And certainly security wasn't on anybody's mind when you think about trade. And I think, like I was saying, I think that that's now, we see that that's not really plausible or realistic in the world we live in, which is now a multipolar world with very powerful countries that are autocratic.
What is the capacity of the US and the West to meet Germany and EU's energy demands without the Nord Stream 2?
That's a great question. And I have to say, I've been trying to figure that out myself. It's not my area of expertise. So I've been reading on this, and my take is that, wow, I mean, this is crazy because this issue shows us how messy the issues are. There's environmental concerns, there's geopolitical security concerns. This Nord Stream 2 just hits all the nerves, right? It's a really difficult issue. So how did we get here? Remember, it's I'm sorry, what's the nuclear disaster in Japan a few years back? Fukuyama, am I right? Yes. So in reaction, the Germans decided that they were going to close down their nuclear power plants. At the same time, they're winding down coal. And so for these reasons, environmental goals, they end up needing more gas, secure gas. So this is how we get to this point. And then, but all along, people have been critical that it had these security implications because this was happening. This all starts back in 2000. I mean, the idea for the second pipeline starts before 2011, but it's agreed in 2011. So already at that point, you see a grumbling Russian bear, So all along, it's like these two things were happening. And so I guess just to get to the heart of this question of what can happen, you can see what we're trying to do is amp up the availability of liquefied gas to Europe. But I'm not expert enough to know how practical that is in a medium term, time frame. Maybe one of you knows. My sense is that Germany's going to need natural gas for the transition for quite a while. And the Europeans, let's not forget, are way ahead of the rest of the world in renewables and the percentage of their energy that they get from renewables. And so if anybody can get there fast, it'll be the Europeans. And the Germans will be out in front on this, and they are, but they're nowhere near. If you're not going to use nuclear, don't forget, like other countries, there's a whole controversy in the EU right now over what will count. Is nuclear going to count towards the EU, what countries need to do to meet their climate change requirements? And so nuclear is going to make it, but the Germans were against that. And there are countries like France that are fully, almost fully reliant on nuclear power plants. So a lot of this is not clear. There's a lot of unknowns, but that's exactly what we should be asking is, so how fast can the Germans get to where they don't need the Russian gas? I don't think anybody knows.
We have time for one more question. So as we pay attention to headlines and world happenings, what's coming? What should we be paying attention to? What should we be looking out for?
Could you just repeat that again? I just got distracted from something in my room.
Absolutely. So as we're watching headlines, seeing what's coming, what are those things we should be paying attention to? What should, what might be coming?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, okay, I teach international politics, and we really do need to return our attention to questions of nuclear weapons, in part because of changes in Russia and changes in China and new technological advances. So I stay up at night worried about that. I also think we need to, and we sort of got lulled for a while into thinking it wasn't top of the agenda, but I do think it's top of the agenda again. Of course, there's North Korea in that. I think also, I mean, I stay up at night thinking about climate change, and this is where I do think the place to look is Europe, because they're ahead of the game here. And I think their approach, which is to integrate your climate policies into every other area of policymaking, that's what you have to do. It needs to be intimately tied to your economy. And their new Green Deal does that. And if you're interested in what they're doing, just Google Europe new Green Deal, and it's very impressive. So those are two top of my list. But then I guess I'd put the third is that where are you going to get bigger markets from in this world of greater geopolitical rivalry? And this is really where I do turn to the transatlantic, at least from the point of view of the US. This is, to me, the default, the obvious, is that we need closer ties with like-minded countries. And a lot of like-minded countries are in Europe. Of course, the first step is looking inward, both in Europe and the United States, and dealing with the illiberal tendencies in both places, because that does spill over into international commerce.
Well, Dr. Posner, this has been absolutely spellbinding. There are more questions that we didn't even get to. We clearly could have spent the better part of the afternoon learning from your wisdom and your expertise. So thank you for giving so generously of your time and knowledge.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I didn't say in the beginning, but hello, there's a number of people who are friends out there, and I appreciate your coming. I appreciate all of you for coming and putting up with the scholars, 10 or 15 minutes of your time.
Oh, good heavens. It's a gift. Truly. Thank you.